This Torah class is brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.
Okay, Bruchim Habayim. Welcome everyone. Shalom Aleichem. Hope everyone is doing well. Last week we had off because of Tainas Esther, and I believe next week will be our final session before we begin Chodesh Nisan, before Pesach. So we'll definitely be getting together next week, and we'll see beyond that in terms of scheduling for Pesach. But today we do perhaps the most important of all the malachos, and truth be told, this is the malacha that we started with because of its relevance, and we said we would revisit it when we get up to it in the order, and in fact we are going to be revisiting it today, and that is the malacha which in the Mishnah Masechta Shabbos is called oifeh, baking, which commonly we understand as Bishul, cooking. This is the 11th malacha, and is the final malacha in what is called Sidura de Pas, the order of bread. So we already did planting, plowing, reaping, bundling, threshing, winnowing, selecting, grinding, sifting, kneading, and now we're ready for some challah. I'm sure you're very excited to greet the challah. Maybe you'll even sing L'chadoy the Likras Challah. No, but don't confuse the challah and the kala. But this is the final malacha of Sidura de Pas. And the Mishnah Berurah writes in the Hakdama of Hilchos Shabbos that Hilchos Shabbos presents a very big hurdle for those who are not initiated in the halachos. But specifically, the Mishnah Berurah says that if one is not aware of Hilchos Bishul, Shehiyah, Hatmana, all the various details that it comes, that is involved in cooking, one can stumble in these very important halachas. Now, so you'll say, okay, I'll eat cold food on Shabbos. I'll have salami, and I'll have bread, and I'll even put a pickle on it. And why do I have to worry about Bishul? The answer is, it is important to have hot food on Shabbos. The Baal Amar in the beginning of Parakira says, it is a takana of our Chachamim to enjoy the Shabbos b'chamin. Chamin is Cholent, hot food that you're eating on Shabbos that was warmed up before Shabbos. In fact, the Baal Amar writes, anyone who does not eat hot food on Shabbos, you need to check into their lineage. If maybe he's a min. So I'm not here to scare you, and I'm not here to give you culinary advice, but it is ancient Jewish practice to have hot food on Shabbos, and therefore if you're going to have hot food on Shabbos, then one can likely come to a situation where somebody is going to be violating the halachos. Now, first thing we need to know is, where was Bishul done in the Mishkan? The Ureim says the Av Malacha is oifeh, baking. However, as we're going to see, there's a reason why the Mishnah Masechta Shabbos refers to it as baking and not cooking. As we're going to see in the Gemara says it's because Sidura de Pas Nakat. That is the Gemara in Shabbos Ayin Daled Amid Beis, that the reason why it's referred to as baking is because it's being listed in the order of the production of bread. Now, where was baking or cooking used in the Mishkan? So we mentioned miraculously herbs grew in the desert. They ground it into powder. They mixed it, so that's they planted, they plowed, they reaped the herbs, they ground it into a powder, that's toichein, they mixed it with water, that's lush, they made it into a paste, and then they cooked the paste. So you may wonder, how did herbs grow in the desert? As we said many times, Tosfos and Chulent, Peichesim and Beis says that when the Jews were in the desert flourished, it became fertile. In fact, the Arachaim HaKadosh in Vayikra, Tesvav Lamed Beis, writes that the Be'era Shel Miriam was a traveling, watering source of fertilization for what needed to grow in the Midbar. Now, Let's go through what is the Av Melacha, what are the Toldos, and what are the Drabanans. The Rambam says in Hilchos Shabbos, Parak Tes, Halacha Aleph, one who cooks or bakes the amount of a dried fig is chayiv. Whether you bake bread, or you cook food, or spices, or you heat up water. Now bear that in mind. If somebody merely heats up water on Shabbos, that is Bishul D'Oraisa. You'll ask, why would that be Bishul D'Oraisa? You're not changing the water. The water could be drunk perfectly well while it was cold. But as we're going to see, because heating up water improves the water, in my, maybe in my old age over here, I started enjoying hot water. I like to drink hot water. When I was a kid, I wouldn't go near it. Now I like hot water. Coffee is not always good. You don't always want caffeine. You don't want sugar. But hot water is geschmack. I love, the simple pleasures in life. Cold water is not the same. It has a different flavor. It has a different taste. Okay. Then, so that's using fire directly. If you place an egg, the Rambam says, near an urn. So now, the source of heat is not fire, but the source of heat is something that was warmed up by fire. That is a tolda da'ar, and that is an av melacha, just like using the fire itself. Because someone who's mevashel with a product of the fire is exactly like one who uses the fire. Now, what are the toldos? Now, if I could remind you, let's see who is paying attention. You're going to have to remember from about 3 months ago. Which siman in Shulchan Aruch is Hilchos Bishul? Remember our mnemonic? Naritzcha v'nakdishcha kisoid siach. Siach is Shin Yud Ches. What's in Siman Shin Yud Ches? Sarfei Kodesh, the holy fire. What's a holy fire? Hilchos Bishul. So Hilchos Bishul is in Siach, Shin Yud Ches. Okay. Now the Rambam says, what are the toldos of Bishul? One who melts metal, even a little bit. One who heats metal until it becomes red hot. That is a tolda of Mevashel. One who melts wax. One who melts fat. One who melts tar, sulfur, pitch. These are all derivatives of cooking. So you'll say, well, maybe cooking is only if you take a hard substance and you soften it. No, says the Rambam. If you cook or bake earthenware kalim until it becomes cheres, so in other words, you take mud and you turn it into pottery, that's also mavashal. Mavashal is not only softening something that's hard, it's also hardening something that's soft. Anybody who harnesses the power of fire to transform a substance is violating Bishul. And then the Yisurei D'Rabbanan is what is called Tolda D'Shemesh. Now, if you cook something in the sun, that is not considered cooking, and it's even mutter. I remember when I was a kid, my parents, our family was invited to another family for Shabbos. So the adults got to sit indoors in the air conditioning, and the kids were relegated to the back porch. And it was a blazing hot day, and they left the potato kugel on the porch, and we went down, I don't know what, we were playing ball or something, and but don't play ball on Shabbos, and we were very young, and we came back, and the potato kugel was very well done. What happened? It was from the sun. It was from the sun. The sun could cook. Now, can you intentionally put potato kugel out in the sun? Absolutely, you're allowed to. You're allowed to cook in the sun. It's not even an Isser D'Rabbanan. However, to heat something up on something that was heated by the sun, that is an Isser D'Rabbanan. Sometimes you have a hot sidewalk or hot sand. You want to crack open an egg. Roast an egg on a hot sidewalk or hot sand. So the halacha is, that is an Isser D'Rabbanan. So you say, how could that be? How could it be that you cannot cook on something heated up by the sun, but you're allowed to cook directly in the sun? The answer is very simple. You're allowed to cook directly in the sun because you would never mistake and confuse the sun for fire. But something that was heated up by the sun, nobody could tell the difference between something that's heated up by the sun or something heated up by fire. So a hot sidewalk or a hot sand, there's nothing about it that indicates that what it was heated up by. And therefore you cannot heat up something that's heated by the sun. That's an Isser D'Rabbanan. Okay, so for instance, the Gemara in Pesachim on Daf Mem Aleph, Amud Aleph says, someone who cooks with the Chamei Tiveria, the hot springs of Tiveria, is pater, but it's aser. Why are you pater? Why is it not an Isser D'Oraisa? It's not an Isser D'Oraisa because it's not from the fire, but it's aser midrabanan because it's tolda d'shemesh. Fine. By the way, there is an opinion that the Chamei Tiveria is heated up by Gehenim. But we're not going with that opinion. We're going with the opinion that the Chamei Tiveria is heated by the sun. Now, comes the Gemara, and the Gemara says, why does everybody agree that you're allowed to heat up straight in the sun? Says the Gemara, says Rashi, you know why everybody agrees you're allowed to heat up in the sun? De'ein derech bishulai bekach. It is not the usual way to cook. People don't usually cook directly in the sun. So since it's not the usual way to cook, you're allowed to cook in the sun on Shabbos. From this Rashi we see a very important principle. Namely, if the manner and the mode with which you cook is not typical, one is allowed to cook that way on Shabbos, and this brings to a very interesting discussion of whether one is allowed to use a microwave on Shabbos. Again, obviously you're going to have to get around the problem of turning on an electric appliance, but let's just talk about the specific act of cooking with a microwave. Comes Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, and he says, based on this Rashi, Rav Shlomo Zalman is in the Mincha Shloimeh, Chelek Aleph, Siman Yud Beis. He says you should be allowed to use a microwave on Shabbos. Why? Because if you're allowed to cook in the sun, because it's not a typical way to cook, then a microwave is not a typical way to cook either. Says Rav Shlomo Zalman, typical cooking is you take a fire and the fire applies and supplies heat to the item that is being heated up. That is typical cooking. However, a microwave does not supply heat to an item. What a microwave does is it causes it creates molecular movement. The molecules in the food now have friction and they rub against each other, and that produces heat. So that's not typical cooking. Typical cooking is convection is when you supply heat to another item. Microwave is you cause molecular activity and there's friction in between the items and it causes the food to heat up itself. Rav Shlomo Zalman says you're allowed to use a microwave on Shabbos. If you could have a manual, now again it would be an Isser D'Rabbanan, but if you had a choyle, someone who was sick, maybe that would be there would be instances that you could be lenient. However, Rav Moshe says no. In his opinion, a microwave is a typical way to cook. Says Rav Moshe, in his opinion, a microwave is a better way to cook. Says Rav Moshe, the only reason that not everyone uses a microwave is because not everybody has a microwave. If everyone would have it, they would use it. It's even a better way to cook. Why put something in an oven for 2 hours when you could put it in a microwave for 4 minutes? Says Rav Moshe, the only reason why people don't use it is because people don't have one. What would Rav Shlomo Zalman say? I would imagine Rav Shlomo Zalman would say, look, the heat of a microwave may not be as effective, it may not heat things as evenly as an oven. You put different things on your plate. You put a piece of chicken, a piece of potato kugel, and asparagus. In all likelihood, one of the items will be hot, the other one will still be ice cold. You know how it is with the microwave; it doesn't heat things evenly. So maybe Rav Shlomo Zalman would say that's not a typical way to cook. Okay, but be it as it may, this principle that it has to be derech bishul is a very important principle when it comes to cooking. Now let's talk about another very important and interesting chakira. The Rambam says, one other item. And that is, the Gemara tells us that if you heat up something that was already heated up, let's say you cook something that was already cooked, are you chayiv or are you not chayiv? The Gemara says in Shabbos on Daf Lamed Tes, Kol shaba bechamin milafnei Shabbos, shorin oisa bechamin Shabbos. Anything that was basically cooked before Shabbos, you're allowed to cook on Shabbos. So the Gemara is giving an opening that there are circumstances that you're allowed to cook on Shabbos, namely if the item was already cooked. Comes the Rashba, and the Rashba has a kula, and the Rashba says, what does it mean if it was already cooked? Well, we know there's this Ganav, his name is Ben Drusai, who he's always on the run. Now, that used to be, he used to be always on the run. Nowadays he's not on the run anymore, because in New York they like to defund the police. So Drusai, he could actually cook his food 100% and nobody's going to get him. But back in the day, when there was law and order in the world, so Drusai would always be on the run. He was afraid the cops are going to get him. So Drusai would only cook his food a third of the way. So anything, according to the Rashba, that's cooked, K'machal ben Drusai, you're allowed to stir it on Shabbos. This is a very important halacha. One may not stir food on a fire on Shabbos, because stirring food that's cooking is tantamount to cooking. That's a very important halacha to be aware of. One is not allowed to stir food that's cooking on Shabbos. However, says the Rashba, if it already cooked a third, there's no issue of stirring, because stirring is cooking. But if it already cooked 1/3, it would be permitted. However, comes the Rambam, and the Rambam says, no, you cannot stir food unless it's 100% cooked. If it's not 100% cooked, you're not allowed to stir food on Shabbos. Oh, here we go. That's the shita of the Rambam. In order to be able to stir food, it has to be cooked 100%. Who do we paskin like? Are we lenient like the Rashba, and if the food is cooked a third, you're allowed to stir it? Or are we machmir like the Rambam? Shulchan Aruch and Siman Shin Yud Ches Sif Daled paskins like the Rambam, that unless your food is 100% cooked, you may not stir it on Shabbos. However, the Bir Halacha expresses surprise that the Mechaber is paskening like the Rambam, when most Rishonim agreed to the Rashba, namely the Rosh, the Ramban, Rabbeinu Yoina, most Rishonim hold that if food is 1/3 cooked, it's not subject to being cooked anymore. Therefore, the Bir Halacha says, even though we will certainly be concerned for the Shita of the Rambam, that food must be totally cooked to be able to stir it, or, by the way, or to be able to put it back on the fire. Nevertheless, if, for whatever reason, a food was taken off the fire, b'di'eved, you could put it back so long as it's 1/3 cooked, like the Shita of the Rashba. Now we come to another important halacha, and that is, Rabbi Isai, what about something that was totally cooked, that even according to the Rambam, you could stir and put back, however, it cooled off? Can something that is 100% cooked and cooled off, is it subject to be cooked again? So the Rosh says, that's right. If it's dry, it's not subject to be cooked again. But if it's a liquid, then you can't return it to the fire, because yesh bishul achar bishul, if something cooled off. The Rashba says no. That once something is cooked, solid or liquid, even if it cooled off, if it's totally cooked, you could put it back on the fire. The opinion of the Ramah is that we are lenient. That a liquid that was totally cooked, you're allowed to return, you're allowed to put back in a place that you're allowed to return something to. However, not if it's totally cooled off. It has to be, it has a little bit of warmth left. In other words, if you have a liquid, and again, you can't put something back on a blech on Shabbos regardless. We're going to come to that soon. In other words, once food is taken off a blech on Shabbos, if you let go of that food and did not have in mind to put it back on the blech, you can't put it back on the blech, because the blech is directly on a fire. But let's say a hot plate. So you're allowed to put dry food that's totally cooked on a hot plate. What about cold food? What about a liquid? Liquid that's cold and totally cooked, you cannot put on a hot plate. but if it's still a little bit warm, you're allowed to put it back on the hot plate. That is the opinion of the Rama. Now let's come to a very interesting question. The Rambam says, anything that does not need bishul, and you cook it, you're pater. Something that's completely cooked, you cook it, you're pater. Rabbi Akiva Eiger explains, why something that doesn't need to be cooked are you pater? Because, says Rabbi Akiva Eiger, since you're able to eat it raw, so the cooking does not really add an important factor. You're allowed midoraisa, let's say in other words an apple. According to the Rambam, anything that does not need to be cooked or anything that can be eaten raw, there's no isur doraisa to cook on Shabbos. The question is, didn't the Rambam say that one is not allowed to heat up water on Shabbos? And water is certainly something that could be eaten raw, could be drank raw. So how do we reconcile these statements of the Rambam? The Rambam says that anything that could be eaten raw, there's no isur d'oraisa of cooking. The Rambam says the very definition of bishul is heating up water. Or, by the way, the Mishnah Berurah says that to cook an apple on Shabbos is bishul d'oraisa, even though Rabbi say the apple certainly could be eaten raw. So the Shar HaTzion explains as follows. He says, something that doesn't really improve by cooking it, because you could eat it raw. For that item, there's no bishul da'iraisa. However, if something could be eaten raw, but cooking it improves it, like cooking an apple, or heating up water. So yes, you could have partook of the water, even though it was cold. But cooking it enhances the water, that would be bishul, full-fledged bishul da'iraisa. So what I would like to do now, in our remaining time, is discuss one of the most common situations where it is essential to be familiar with the laws of bishul. And that is because this is something that comes up very often. So it's Friday night, it's like a half hour after the meal, and my teenage son says to me, Daddy, how about some Oinig Shabbos? So what? What do you mean Oinig Shabbos? We just finished the meal, a half hour. He says, Oinig Shabbos. And by now I know already. When Yehuda Glatstein says Oinig Shabbos, he means Cholent Friday night. That's what he wants. He wants some Cholent Friday night. Here's the problem. By us, we have Cholent on a crock pot. So Cholent on a crock pot, for the most part, is considered like a pot on the blech. You're not allowed to take food out of a pot that's cooking on a fire on Shabbos, even if it's on a blech, or out of a crock pot. In other words, you cannot stand there by the crock pot with a big spoon and scoop cholent out of the pot while it's on the crock pot. I mean, that's like stirring. You can't take food out of the cholent while it's cooking on the crock pot or while it's on the fire. So you say, okay, I'll take it off. Take it off the crock pot. The problem is then you're going to have freezing cold cholent tomorrow. No, there's only one thing worse than not having cholent Shabbos morning. Having cold cholent Shabbos morning. So, if you're going to take the cholent off the fire, then you're not going to have cholent the next day. So you say, no problem, I'll take the cholent off the fire for 5 minutes, and I'll scoop out the cholent. We'll give all the hungry boys who they're still growing their cholent, even though the meal was a half hour before. And we'll put it back. The only thing is, there's a halacha, chazara is asr. Now, many people get confused. They think chazara is asr, and they don't review anything they learned. No, that kind of chazara is encouraged. When we say chazara is asr, is food taken off, even a blech or a crock pot on Shabbos, cannot be put back. Say, why not? It's still piping hot, and it might be fully cooked, so why can't you put it back? And the answer is, it's mechsi kimavashal. It looks like you're cooking. The innocent bystander sees a guy. He didn't know you took it off 5 minutes ago. He knocked on your door. He knocked on the door. All he sees is cholent on your table. and he sees you putting it on the blech or you're putting it on the crock pot. He thinks you're cooking. So one is not allowed to put a pot of food back on a blech or back on a crock pot on Shabbos. However, there are 4 conditions that if you fulfill, you'd be allowed to give the boy his cholent and still have hot cholent tomorrow. The first thing is the fire has to be ketuma. It has to be covered. If the fire is not covered, we're afraid you're going to stoke up the fire. So, what does that mean in the case of a fire? A blach, you have a metal sheet over the fire. What does it mean in terms of a crock pot? Maybe it means that the knob is covered. You may want to cover the knob. That's what it means the fire is covered. What else do you need? You need the food to be fully cooked. If the food is not fully cooked, you cannot take it off the blech or the crock pot and put it back on. Now it doesn't mean it's not going to be more cooked tomorrow. It just means it's fully cooked. It's cooked. It's reached, not macho ben drusai. It's fully cooked. That doesn't mean you wouldn't want it to be cooked more, but it has the status of mavushal kol tzarkai. What else do you need? These are the 2 most important ingredients. That is, when you take it off the fire, you have to have in mind to put it back on. If, let's say, you take it off and you weren't really thinking anyway, there might be room for leniency, but certainly it's best to have in mind to put it back on the fire. And the 4th thing is oida b'yadai. You can't let go of the cholent. That means, so you say, if I can't let go of the cholent, how am I taking the cholent? I'm going to hold the whole pot of cholent in one hand and scoop it out in the other hand? That's one option. Another option is usually taking cholent Friday night is a 2-person job. So one person holds the cholent and the other person scoops it out. But you want to fulfill the following 4 conditions. The fire is covered, which in almost every Jewish home there's a blech on the fire or the crock pot. The knob is covered. It's fully cooked. By the time the meal is over Friday night, usually the cholent is good to go. Certainly, it's every hour on the crock pot is hareza meshubach, no question, but it's still fully cooked already. And you had in mind you're going to put it back, and it's still in your hand. But here's the thing. There's something about cholent that, I don't know what it is, that even though the bag of beans, before you put it in the pot, only weighed about 1/10 of a pound, by the time it gets in the pot, the cholent pot weighs about 350 pounds. How that happened, that's one of the great miracles of the Lord, the miracle of cholent. But it's sometimes very hard to hold it. So Rav Moshe has a kula that you don't have to suspend the cholent in midair. As long as you're holding on to the handle, it would be permitted to rest it on the counter as long as it's still within the person's hand. Now, that's a little bit dangerous because you might forget and let go of the cholent for a moment. Now, if you did forget and you let go of the cholent for a moment, but you had in mind that you're going to put it back, it would be permitted to put it back. But to do this in the best possible way, you want the cholent to be fully cooked. You want to have in mind you're going to put it back. You want to keep it in your hand, and the flame needs to be covered. And if you do that, you could be Mekayim, the mitzvah, Midivrei Neviim of Oineg Shabbos, and Kol Hama'aneg es HaShabbos, anyone who delights in the Shabbos, Noisnin loy nachala beli mitzarim b'Ribbono Shel Olam, bequeaths to us a unlimited inheritance. May we be zoicha to be ma'aneg the Shabbos mitoich zehiros in all Hilchos Shabbos b'chol dikdukeha u'prateha v'kavnaseha. Okay, thanks everyone for joining today. And Bez Hashem, next week we begin the new series of Malachos. We've now completed Sidura de Pas, and we continue on in the 12th Malacha of Shabbos. Thanks everyone for joining. Bracha v'atzlacha, Agun Shabbos.
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.